Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as one tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
A big thank you to our show sponsors, The Soil School, Profitable Practices, and RealAg on the Weekend. In partnership with Bourgault Radio in Saskatoon, Real Agriculture is pleased to present RealAg on the Weekend with host Sean Haney. Listen live on Saturdays at 4 p.m. local time on 650 CKOM Saskatoon and 980 CJME Regina, or of course find it at realagriculture.com or on RealAg's podcast feeds. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith. Thank you all for joining us here, even with the snide remarks about me being on time. That's okay, Peter. I don't mind. All right. Of course, yes. Welcome here. Great lineup. I'm super excited about tonight. It is Earth Day. It is April 22nd. That's right, Earth Day. And so we are talking intercropping. But before we get to that conversation, of course, your reminder that if you do collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Let us know you watch the show. We'll get you those CEU credits. And of course, shout out to everybody watching us on RFD TV Canada as well. And welcome, Kevin. He thought he was late, but see, right on time. Okay, so wonderful. Kevin Judd, happy spring to you as well. It certainly does feel like it, getting some field work done here in Ontario. All right, for tonight's guests, to talk about intercropping, what it is, what works, what doesn't, we've got our dream team from Saskatchewan joining us. Pretty excited about this. We've got Lana Shaw from the Southeast Research Farm and Maryse Bourgault from the University of Saskatchewan joining us. Welcome here, Lana. Welcome here, Maryse.
Hello.
Good evening.
Thanks for having us.
I'm so excited about this conversation. We were talking just before we hopped on live, just kind of how long we've even been aware of intercropping and working with it and these sorts of things. And my first introduction to it was in 2011 in Saskatchewan, and we've actually got a clip from the farmer that I went to go visit. But that was last year that we went to go visit him, but he's been at it a while. That's Colin Rosengren, so we'll check in on that. But let's start with, of course, for the two of you, the work that you're doing in intercropping. Lana, I'll start with you. What keeps you busy at the research farm? What are the projects that you're working on?
Well, we're continuing on with the chickpea flax work. So that's a good one right now. We've expanded into doing some more forage work. So like the marginal acres, saline, wetland margins, some of those areas, the kochia hotspots, and how to convert them. So that's a kind of a growth area for us, even if it's a big problem for the farmers.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to look at it. It's a exciting thing to explore, but not a great issue to have on your farm. But glad you're working on some of the solutions, that's for sure. And Maryse, welcome here. What are you working on at the U of S?
Yes, thanks. Well, my job is to work at alternative cropping systems. I don't want to call them novel because some of it was done in before modern agriculture, really. But we had a project that was specifically looking at intercropping with faba beans, but also comparing it to other intercrops. Now we're working a little bit with cover crops as intercrops, so in
Right.
alternate rows. So we're kind of mixing the two together as well and seeing how that might work.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a really, really interesting point. And one of the cool things that a few weeks ago when we did an episode on cover cropping, the sort of the different way that we're looking at it in Western Canada than we do in the East. Maybe just quickly, Maryse, if you can. So just talk me through that. We're cover cropping alternating rows, but during the growing season, so at the same time. Is that makes sense?
Yes, we actually have 4 different establishment methods. So we're trying to broadcast them before the season, see how that goes. We drilled them as alternate crops in the canola and the wheat. We've tried to broadcast mid-season so that you would have a little bit of the establishment, but not too much competition. And then we have what is a little bit more standard in trying to establish them after the season as a shoulder crop. So
Okay.
I don't have really good results for you, unfortunately, on that, because that's still a project that's ongoing. But
Yeah.
yeah, talk to me again next year or the year after.
We will, absolutely. But that's the fascinating thing about taking some of these practices and then figuring out, where they fit, or tweaking them slightly and changing them a little bit for the situation, for sure. That really does sort of combine a whole bunch of things, but we're challenged in the West, especially by a short season. Moisture is limiting. Lana, let's back it up just a step, focusing on the intercrops. We were talking, 2010 was when you sort of got introduced to it and writing a proposal to start researching it. What are the benefits of intercropping that have made this interesting and made you want to research it and made farmers want to try it?
Um, one of the things that I like about it is I grew up on a really variable glacial till landscape. I'm farming on this really variable glacial till landscape. And not every crop is ideally suited to every part of the landscape. So by combining those crops, you're getting more production sometimes out of those varying areas. So the balance changes over that spatial range of topography. And that interplay between the crops with the landscape is just something that makes sense to me and appeals to me. So that's something I like about it. I like the complexity of it. I think for some people that's daunting, but for me that just is really interesting. And growing one crop at a time becomes a little bit boring when you're trying to do two at a time.
So you like a challenge, is what you're saying, Lana?
I think so. I like the complexity of trying to understand what's happening and how I can influence it.
Mm-hmm. Now, Maryse, in the work that you're doing, and we've got some great visuals, we're going to go through a couple different combinations and what has worked and what not. What are some of the questions when you're setting up these trials? What are some of the questions you're trying to answer? Like, is the seeding of it not really an issue, or is that still an issue? Is it where
For
do some of
us,
the
it
challenges?
wasn't. So,
Yeah.
with the alternate rows for us, it wasn't an issue. Trying to see that. This said, we did not look at the different proportions that you might want to have in one crop versus the other.
Yeah.
We decided to do alternate rows with the same density as they would normally be. So that's not the question that we were looking for, but we were looking for, particularly with the experiment that we had, we wanted to find good companion crops for faba beans because we know that in Saskatchewan, Agronomists is an important problem. People are interested in having a legume as part of their rotation. Pea lentils are susceptible. Faba bean isn't. But faba bean is susceptible to a lot of foliar diseases as well. So we were thinking that actually intercropping might work really well with faba beans in providing you with a little bit of a barrier between rows so that you could actually slow that disease. This is actually really hard to look at in small plots. So we were really focusing on the productivity of the system and trying to figure out, like, do you have more yields overall having both of these crops together compared to having them separate? And then Warren also had a project trying to look at the soil health indicators that were associated with these intercrops as well, and trying to see, do we see some of those nutrients? Do we see some of those pulses actually helping, leaking some of that nitrogen to the companion crop? And in terms of other soil health indicators, do we see some benefits there? So it was fairly immediate benefits, basically.
Okay, yeah. So and that's so I knew that about faba beans. I didn't know that it was so susceptible to foliar diseases, which just so happens to, when one thing works, we have to throw in a wrench in a different way. But still, interesting for sure. Okay, so Lara's got a good question, and one of the things that we do see, and Lana, I know you've done some work on these as well. So we do see several different mixes. Some work better than others for different reasons. Lara de Mozak asks if you've ever done nodule assessments on any of these studies so that the pulse crop is actively fixing N. So Lana, when you're doing some of these assessments, are you doing root assessments and nodulation assessments? Or are you taking it to yield? What sort of things do you measure in these plots?
I have yet to actually do nodule assessments as a rating metric, but there's been a few trials where we're doing N15 studies. So where they're putting a nice isotope of nitrogen, and it's a neat way where you can track what percentage of the nitrogen in the pulse or in the non-pulse came from the atmosphere versus from the soil. So some of those trials have been ongoing, and so in Melanie Reed's master's project, Jeff Shano was her supervisor for that at the U of S. They were finding the chickpeas were feeding the flax to a substantial extent, and it's not the first time that you can find examples of that happening. But I think that might be the first time that it was seen in a mixed grain intercrop. And Dr. Kui Lu also has a project that we've been involved in where we were looking at N15, this isotope tracer nitrogen, to try to answer that question. And then there's sometimes we can sort of see it indirectly just in terms of yield. There's ways of doing, with it, like we did with and without nitrogen on our chickpea flax. So you can see some of the interactions that will happen. When you give the flax and chickpeas fertilizer, you get more flax but less chickpeas. There's definitely some benefits going on there as far as nitrogen dynamics. But one of the things that people like, there's some nitrogen transfer, but there's also that it's making the pulses more efficient at fixing nitrogen. Because once you're soaking up the nitrate that's floating around in the soil with the non-legume, then the legumes tend to work a little harder. So it's not just as simple as it's transferring nitrogen. It's just it can generate quite a bit of nitrogen, and that Reed paper talks about that some. Now, it's not as much as if you just grew chickpeas as far as nitrogen fixation, but you have a balance of two crops. So given the amount of pulse that's being produced, it's actually quite a high amount of nitrogen that's being fixed in that intercrop.
Mm-hmm. Maryse, I think a lot of your work has suggested similar things as well. Now, Peter wants to know, and if we don't have this answer, that's okay. But I love that we have N15, by the way, and Lara does too. She's like, that's even better than a nodulation assessment. I love that we can actually figure out where this nitrogen went, which is brilliant. But when we say the chickpea was feeding the flax to a large extent, like how much of what the flax needs was actually provided? Do we have like even a estimation?
Yeah.
Maryse, go ahead.
There's numbers in that paper that I don't remember off the top of my head, but if I was pressed to come up with a number, it was depending on the situation, like 30 to 50, I think is where it was kind of landing. And that was, it's not necessarily going to be that high all of the time. But that's what we were picking up there. And I don't know of any trials that are going on for 2024 with N15 work, but I wish there was a little bit more of that going on, so we could capture that efficiency, like how much can you expect. It was a lot of years ago I did a project with Fran Wally, and we were looking at it in chickpea flax, and I think it was probably 2014, kind of like 10 years ago, and we didn't find very much, but there was almost no nitrogen fixation going on in the chickpeas at all those years, even in the monocrops, because it was too wet and there was massive amounts of mineralization and there was a lot of disease. So it just wasn't a year where we were having much luck picking it up. So it's going to vary over locations and years for sure.
Yeah. Maryse?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, that it's really hard to find a number as well, because every year is going to be different. And as you've mentioned, Lindsay, we are in a semi-arid environment where we have vast fluctuations in the yield potentials that we have, right? So what we found, for example, in our pea canola intercrops, that we always had more production overall with the intercrops compared to having those crops separate. But at the same time, 2021 was very dry for us. So, and what we did is that we didn't actually put any nitrogen fertilizer in that intercrop. So you're getting a comparison with a canola crop, monocrop, that's fully, that has 60 pounds of N versus nothing in the intercrop. 2021 being such a dry year, there probably wasn't a big need for a lot of nitrogen. So whatever was in the soil and whatever the pea could contribute actually worked quite well. 2022 was an average year, but then we're moving to a different spot, right? So we're still working on barley stubble, and it was an average year, but we still had about 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen residuals from the previous year. So I wouldn't cut your fertilizer entirely, right?
Right.
And it depends how you do it as well, because if you mix everything, then you don't want your fertilizer to actually inhibit that nodulation in the peas. Yes. So, but if you have alternate rows and you can sideband each of those crops properly, then you might be able to have a little bit more of that fertilizer with the non-legume, and not affect the other legume.
I think you have both just summed up in like a few moments the reason we do multi-year trials. In that, especially when you can go from extreme drought to maybe more average, but there's implications of having had the drought the year before, and so yeah, absolutely those year over year. Now, there's some great questions that have come in that we're going to get to in just a moment, but we're going to actually because we've mentioned it a couple times. This is a 7-year-old clip, producer Jay. It's the one with Scott Chalmers that is about intercropping, and he uses the term overyielding. So we're going to look at this clip and then talk a little bit about what overyielding means and get to some of your questions right after this.
Basically what we found is when the plants are basically growing on top of each other in the same row, that's when we get the greatest benefit in overyielding. And as we separate those rows out, that benefit is still there, but it's less and less. Some of the other research shows in that study that we're actually using more moisture in intercropping, which makes sense if we're producing a greater crop. The other thing we found is that there's probably some nitrogen sharing that is from maybe fixed from the pea and potentially given up to the canola, where the canola would pick it up and put it into production. We find our soil nitrogen credit is lower in intercropping with pea than it would be just pea on its own, and that's sort of proof that canola is using some of that excessive nitrogen credit produced by pea. We also suspect that we're actually using more phosphorus as well, maybe more potash too. If we're over yielding, we're obviously removing more nutrients from the soil. So our future work that we want to do is look at phosphorus and see if we can get a response with higher phosphorus rates. It's also important, if we are removing grain from the land with the nutrients in that grain, that we replace what we've taken away and put it back into the soil, whether it's fertilizer or maybe cropping, some other cover crop or something like that.
Going back to when you say over yielding, can you expand on what you've seen in terms of numbers?
What we've seen with over yielding, we have seen anywhere from 10% to all the way up to 60% yield benefit, and we define that as a land equivalent ratio. For example, if we have a ratio of 1.2, that means we would need 20% more land to grow the two crops if they were separate. That's one way to give a currency to the topic. You can also use pounds per acre. That kind of works, but putting it in land equivalent ratio or in dollars dollars per acre, we always get that benefit with the economics.
The sponsors of the Agronomists are RealAg on the Weekend, Profitable Practices, and the Soil School. Soil health directly impacts crop health, which directly impacts your bottom line. Real Agriculture Soil School provides an opportunity for farmers to learn how to improve soil health through discussions on the use of cover crops, strip till, no-till, compost, manure, and more. The Soil School is made possible by support from the Mosaic Company. Visit our YouTube page for more. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's talk about over-yielding. Also, I just want to mention Kelvin sounds like a baby in that school from 7 years ago. I bet you Scott feels like he's age 2. Anyway, I do love pulling some of these older videos and just seeing, how far we've come or if things have changed. So we sort of got a feel there for what over-yielding means. Maryse, I'll start with you. When you're figuring out, how much an intercrop yields, are you using land equivalency? How do you sort of figure that out?
Yeah, we do use the land use, the land equivalency and the land use, the LER. We call it the LER, so the land equivalent ratio. And basically all you do in that calculation is that you, assuming that you have 50% of the area for each of the crop, that you'll take your crop, your crop yield in the intercrop, divide by the monocrop yield. So that's where the comparison with a monocrop is really, really important. And then you add those up. And so if you end up with something that's greater than 1, we say that's over yielding. So really what you're saying is that, the both of those yields together is more than what you would have gotten if you had separate fields for it.
Mm-hmm. So Lana, and I know Lara's got some points about different mixes and ones that work well and etc. Do we get an over yielding with every mix every year, or do some really shine and some really do not?
I've seen it fail, and that's valuable, especially in small plots. That's why it's good we're doing small plots.
Yes.
The pea canola, as some of the comments were saying, that one can be tricky. Like it seems like an obvious win, but maturity matching up can be a problem. One year I accidentally put a pea canola trial on land that had been in peas 2 years previously, and I had Maryse's root rot problem. So then I have an under-fertilized canola crop with some tiny sad peas under it that was not good. And my LERs in that situation compared to canola was very not good. The canola comparison did not look good. The comparison to monocrop peas, it was a crop failure all around. So we have to be really careful with the LERs when you're comparing to a crop failure or near crop failure. The other thing is, it's really important how that monocrop is managed. And so some of the time we'll have fertilized and unfertilized non-legume monocrop control. So I'll end up saying this is the LERs compared to an unfertilized flax and a LER compared to fertilized flax. And then you take that with a grain of salt. So it's very easy to get positive LERs compared to an unfertilized, or at least with no nitrogen, monocrop crop. But it's harder to get it compared to a well-managed, well-fertilized monocrop. And so it's not all the time we see it, is it? I think more often than not we do. But I have had situations where because sometimes we're shorting it on nitrogen, and if the legume's not having a great day, it ends up being overall not super productive. But I've also had situations where we end up with LERs of 2 or more, 3, and that's usually where the chickpeas have had a very wet year and there's disease, and the monocrops are just being wiped out or refusing to mature, and the intercrops are faring far better. So we end up with more yield off of our intercrops than the monocrops. So that can be misleading, because it's not like compared to a really good chickpea crop, you're going to get
Right.
triple yield. That's not realistic, but it takes some of the low lows out of the system. But you can miss some of the highs. Like once in a while, we'll have a year where a pulse crop will go 80 or 60 bushels an acre or something. Well, in a monocrop, it's probably not going to do that because you've got two crops that are taking up the space.
So, Maryse, in thinking about that, and that's, you've mentioned the disease aspect as well. So, I mean, this is about nitrogen. Often we're having that discussion, and that is a big question of, we're adding a legume side by side with a non-legume. So there's an end question here. But what have you seen on the disease side as well, as far as what some of these impacts might be that we could potentially be building off of?
Yeah, we haven't seen, actually. I might say Lana might be better at answering that question, because we haven't seen a lot of disease in small plots, and it's a little bit difficult sometimes to actually pick it up. What we've seen in the literature is that it can have an impact, right? So that having that physical barrier of having a crop that is not susceptible. Sometimes if we're thinking about chickpea and flax, you can think about, flax being about double the height of the chickpea. So you get a pretty good barrier there. And so that's what we were hoping to see with faba beans as well. The 2 years that we did have plots there, 2021 very dry, so not a lot of disease until you got to the very end, and then fabas just turn brown, don't they? And so that's it. So, but there is some studies out there that suggest a fairly significant benefit in terms of disease, mostly foliar diseases, right? Not necessarily the soil diseases, but above ground, that's something that can help.
Peter is very curious, Peter Johnson here in Ontario, mostly because our greatest intercrop here is mixed grain, which is oats and wheat and barley that is fed to livestock. I am a big intercrop fan. The mixed grain drives me nuts, and Peter knows that, so he is trolling me. But he does want to know how many acres are being intercropped currently. And I don't know if we have this number. If either of you do, great. But Saskatchewan actually has crop insurance for intercrop crops, does it not?
Yeah. So this year, for the first time, they have an intercrop program specifically for mixed grain intercrops. I haven't had a chance to get fully up to date on the details of that program. One of the problems that we have is we don't have very good data on it. There have been some tens of thousands of acres reported to crop insurance since 2019 kind of time frame. But there's also problems where people don't really want to insure their intercrops because the coverage is not good, or they might grow their chickpeas in an intercrop but report it as a monocrop because reasons. So they're not necessarily going to be very forthcoming from some of those regular means that we rely on to tell us about how things are grown. And we don't really have anything from like the commodity groups to get people to fill out surveys and say how much of the pulse acres are intercropped in the province and how much has that changed over time. I wish we had those kind of numbers.
Those would be wonderful numbers.
We need to develop them, but we need a budget and a grad student to go and do that kind of thing, and currently we haven't got it. So the short answer is we don't know, and it's some tens of thousands of acres total and a bunch of different combinations.
So Lana, I will tell you, you get a gold star, because on this show, we know it's been a successful program if we have either named or developed or thought of someone's master's or PhD project. So you've named one, and so this show is a roaring success officially now. So there you go. Maryse, if you have ideas of other projects you would like done, we can put that out to the universe too. So there you go. But it is a really good point. Certainly we've made some headway on tracking some of this data, but we don't necessarily have as good a data as we would like. Now, there's a couple of really good questions coming in about that nitrogen, how nitrogen is shared or used in the soil. But before we get to that, there's a couple more that we're back a little more where we really haven't talked about the, beyond pea and canola, or piola as sometimes it gets called. I do like to change lots of these names of these intercrops and just smash them together. So let's go through maybe some of the more common, less common, and we do have some visuals as well. So producer Jay, if you could, maybe we'll start with Marissa's first slide, and we'll talk through some of these and whether or not they've been a success. So I think that pea and canola is one of the more common ones, I would say, and more people are familiar with that one. This one's an interesting one. Marissa, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at a faba bean oat intercrop, and so our faba bean breeder thought that would work really well because the maturity would be more or less at the same time. But we actually found that faba beans cannot compete against the oats. The oats are too competitive, and so this is as big as they got, and then they shriveled and died, unfortunately. So sometimes your combinations matter. We see a lot of legume and brassica combinations that seem to work really well, but with cereals it can be a little bit more difficult.
Okay, so Peter is
So I would
cheering for
not
the
recommend
oats.
that one. No.
Yeah, Peter's a jerk. He's cheering for the oats, and they won on this one. I'm a little surprised. Faba beans to me seem like this big, strong plant, and they can get really large, but clearly against a cereal, they just can't compete. So
I think
fascinating.
the
Correct.
oats are just a bit faster at really getting
Mm,
going
yeah,
and maybe getting the root system going. It's maybe not so much above ground competition as below ground.
as below. Yep.
Yes,
Um,
we also thought that maybe, in a dry year, maybe, they just can't do it, but maybe with more moisture they could do it
mm,
as well. So and I got my master's student to actually go through all of the published papers on this, and he found a study, I think in China, if I'm not mistaken, but 2,000, mils of water during the growing season, and the faba still couldn't compete against the cereals.
really?
So
Yeah.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know.
But
But
okay. So
they
this
did well with the flax and the canola, actually. So
okay.
that actually worked better.
Okay, but not oats.
But
Okay,
we
and
not
yeah,
oats and not
not
wheat.
oats.
Wheat wasn't as
Okay.
bad, but that didn't work out so well. This is
Okay.
a canola pea intercrop as well, technically in separate rows. They're really hard to see see the rows at that point. You've seen the canola branch, the peas have also branched out as well, and so they're mingling quite well in the picture.
Mhm. So let's pause on this one for a little bit because this, I think, in a lot of ways shows at times why farmers are interested in an intercrop. In that, to me, looking at this, I see incredible canopy closure as far as trying to outcompete weeds and intercept sunlight. And of course, the peas climb on the canola knits together. And Lana, maybe I'll go to you on this one. And as Jason mentioned, he's in Manitoba, but he mentioned that trying to get the maturities right is a real challenge. Is that the biggest challenge of a pea canola intercrop? Is trying to get those maturities bang on?
We have variety problems for sure, and most of the variety problem is on the canola side in that there's not a lot of clear field genetics anymore.
Mm,
That
right.
and it's tending seems to be getting later and later, because that's where when you're trying to get more and more yield, you just push it a couple
Yep.
days later continuously, and that's pushing it out of the range of maturities on the canola.
Mm,
So sometimes, and then we don't have the shatter tolerance in those
right.
varieties generally either. So if you don't have a wonderful fall where things are going really well and you lose a bunch of canola on the ground and you lose some peas on the ground because you were waiting for the canola to ripen,
Yeah.
nobody's very happy. So it's not a bulletproof intercrop for sure. I think sometimes people have more luck with some of the oddball specialty peas than that. Like
Mm,
you try to get as late a pea as you can, and some of those tannin types like the maple peas and the
okay.
forage pea.
Yep.
Those are and then that's a higher value pea a lot of the time. Those maple peas are worth a lot of money this year.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's
Um,
one that's nice. But if you can get away with it on a weeds side of things, the mustard combination with peas is a little easier as far as maturity goes. You don't
right.
have quite the same herbicides, in-crop herbicide options, but you do have the option of using authority, sulfentrazone, which is can help. And the mustard and peas can get off in a way really quick and compete really well. So that's a nice one, but you don't really want to go talking about mustard in canola country when
No, that is for
it's not,
mustard country. Yeah.
yeah, well, it's not an easy thing to just all of a sudden switch
Yeah.
between canola and mustard, or you're gonna have volunteers.
Yeah. You're going to have a big problem. Yes, excellent observation. Thank you for that. Rosemary and Warren, I'm not sure who is online, but I'll say hello to you both, is asking how much are you reducing seeding rates when you do a mixed crop? So great question. Do we reduce them? Maryse, I'll go to you first. So in this scenario where you're alternating rows, how much do you adjust your seeding rates to put a crop like this together?
Technically, it's 50-50, right? Because you're alternating rows. So there's actually no difference within that row how many plants you would have.
Versus a monocrop.
There are other studies that have, switched between 25-70 all the way, and
Yep.
but we haven't done that in this, no.
Okay, so in this setup where you're alternating rows, you would be doing a full seeding rate for that crop type, but because you're only doing half the field, it's half as much, but in the row.
Correct.
Lana,
Yes.
Lana, if you're doing a trial, maybe with this, are there any of the mixes that you work on that you significantly change the seeding rates for?
So I like to keep the pulse rate relatively high because that's our nitrogen engine. So I'm keeping the pulse rate on a per acre basis, usually around 80% of what a monocrop one is, and then about 50% for whatever brassica so that's for your brassica ones. For our chickpea flax, it's it depends what you call a regular monocrop rate for flax, but that could be 50 pounds an acre, and we're talking about 10 to 15. So it's
Right.
a considerably lower rate in that situation, and then basically full rate chickpeas. Now, if you're talking to the farmers, everybody's sort of figured out for themselves what works on their land. And I very much encourage people to do that because it's relatively easy for them to do a few strips of varying seeding rates as they're going, and then they'll be able to dial it in better on their land. So that's what I've seen work well for us. I like the mixed rows better, and I don't really see a big disadvantage to it, and I'm not that concerned about putting I think that's worked well. I've seen the weed competition be better, that we have a little more weed escapes on the alternating rows, and from visually, no, I don't have good data on that. And we did have a trouble in 2022. I had more disease in my alternating rows than the mixed rows, and it's completely the opposite of what you would really expect. Like the canopy in that mixed row is humid. It's all like there's different rows touching each other. It's all a big tangle, but it's resilient, in a very impressive way that I like. And we were talking about disease just before. We've got multiple years of data for the chickpea flax where it's an impressive difference on plots where we only have 10-foot wide plots. So the fact, and the disease is very patchy. The fact that we're able to get statistically significant differences on 10-foot wide plots on a disease that spreads like crazy spatially, like a leaf disease, there's something very real happening there, but we don't really understand the mechanism. We don't know the mechanism. There's some experiments going on right now to try to look at, is there some kind of induced resistance in the chickpeas, and through mycorrhizal associations or something, are they somehow getting a tip off to become more resistant to the disease? And we don't have an answer to that yet, but it's a fun hypothesis that it might not be actually maybe it's not just a spatial thing. Maybe it's changing the host in some way.
Yeah. I love the idea and the science that we're just learning about how much plants can communicate. That I love this idea that like the roots are like talking to each other, or the fungus in the root structures are like, hey, psst. Anyway, so now that's what I imagine in my head now that they're doing. True or not, it's fine. Okay, producer Jay, can we go to the next one? The next slide, because we're running through time so quickly here. Okay, so here we have another cereal in rotation. Peter will be happy to see. What is this one, and was it a success, Maryse?
This was wheat and lentil. In terms of production, it did exactly the same as if you have them separate. So, in our case, maybe that's not. I mean, and I say it did exactly the same, except this was not fertilized, whereas the wheat would have been fertilized, right? So,
Okay.
you're as Lana said, sometimes, we are kind of comparing apples and oranges and trying to
Right.
figure out how to best compare them. So I think one of the issue from the data that we had, with the Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation, we included that one as an intercrop because in 1 year it had 17,000 acres, and that was really high compared to everything else. So we decided to include it, but then it seems that people don't actually don't insure it, at least, whether or not they
Yeah.
do it or not.
Right.
But one of the issue with it is lentil and wheat are a little bit more difficult to separate compared to pea and
Right.
canola, for example, or mustards, and a bigger seed as well. So chickpea, flax, you have those size differences that
Right.
make it easier to separate. Whereas with lentils and wheat, you almost need a color sorter for it. So
Like they're
so
a different shape very much, but they are quite similar in size. So it's the size difference that makes them difficult. I find that's fascinating. So, but that
yeah.
is, of course, and it's one thing we haven't really touched on yet. And there's a lot of questions about weed control that we're going to touch on in a moment. But that is when we talk an intercrop. So, correct me if I'm wrong. This is a crop that gets seeded at the same time or very soon, right? So potentially in two passes, but maybe in the same pass, however you want to set that up. And then it is harvested at the same time and separated after. And I make that clarification because we do sometimes talk about relay cropping, right, where they're growing perhaps at the same time, but they get harvested or planted at different times. So intercrops are the same or at the same time. So that is my one question on. So harvesting is obviously going to be a consideration. Lana, you said, of course, on the canola side, if you don't have the shadow resistant varieties, that can potentially cause an issue with timing, etc. For the most part, are farmers finding it really challenging, or have they got this figured out? I know we've got a clip of Colin Rosengren, and I know that they've significantly expanded sort of their harvest cleaning operations, but I mean, for them, they don't seem to be that fuzzed up about separating seed after. So, Lana, I'll start with you. Which ones seem to be the most challenging?
Okay, so so which intercrops are the most challenging?
For separation after harvest.
For separation after harvest. The flax and lentils, people will do that sometimes, and if you have, it can be hard to get chipped lentils out of the flax.
Okay.
So that one's a bit tricky, and it doesn't always thresh great. It's a little harder. The chickpea flax generally goes really nicely unless you have that really wet fall where the chickpeas are squishy. If the chickpeas are squishy, they're not helping to thresh the flax, and you just kind of have a mess. And there was a year when we had a bunch of fall rain and wet, and was that, I want to say 2018 maybe, that there was a lot of mess around where there was a lot of people that had very not nice things happening in their monocrops, but also some of those intercrops were not behaving well because of just maturity things, and people were waiting for their the canola wasn't ripening and like it maybe would have as a monocrop or something. It's not 100% where it works great, but it's probably something like 90% where there's not a huge problem.
Not an issue. Yeah.
It's I don't know. There's probably I whenever I'm pulling out numbers, I usually like to try to call out somebody from the audience and say, "Does that sound right?" And I don't know. There's maybe one or two in there that could pipe up in the comment section, but it's when you have hail damage, that can be very not helpful. Because usually one crop will be more set back than another one. So if you have a pea canola that gets hail, that can be a pretty ugly mess.
I don't know that anyone likes harvesting any hailed on crop, but once you add 2 in there, I can only imagine exactly that. You're dealing with different, how they spring back differently and how they recover and stand. And yeah, so I can understand that's a mess. Let's just, we're going to pause. I'm going to go to the clip with Colin Rosengren because there's a few things I want to leap off of. And this clip is from our Profitable Practices series. I highly recommend going. Everybody go check out the whole thing. Colin, I actually toured his farm in 2011 when they had, I think they were a couple of years into their journey, and they've continued to do it ever since. And so, and they've been really sort of fine tuning this as far as their farm, and great to see the research that's been expanding and continuing in Saskatchewan. And so let's go to that clip, Producer Jay, and then we'll come back and talk a bit about weed control and a bit about growth characteristics as well of the crops themselves.
So I got to ask, it's unique. There are people that are doing it. How did you get started intercropping?
I guess the big thing was kind of an economic driver. Back in 2004, the prices were quite low. Canola $6, peas less than $4. Just trying to figure out a way of getting extra yield and lower input costs at the same time. And then a lot of it was observations that we'd seen anytime we see volunteer crops coming in another crop. It always did a lot better. Head of volunteer durum in a barley field, for example, and the head will be full 8-10 row, the best head of durum you'll ever see. So just recognizing that there was an opportunity for another crop to succeed within a monoculture situation let us think maybe we should plan that and put some more of something else in there.
It's a little bit of a mind bender. We're used to, we'll call it monocropping. This is polycropping, I guess we should call it. What do you think it is that creates this 1 + 1 = 3 sort of scenario?
Well, I kind of often end up flipping that around of what makes us think we should grow just one. If we go out there to any natural system, we'll never find just one plant growing because there's always opportunity of time and space and resources that's more diverse and spread out. And so to try and design a single crop to use everything at that same time doesn't match the supply and demand curve, I guess. So anything we can do to flatten out that demand curve of our crop by spreading out multiple crops is going to help us to match the supply better.
The sponsors of the Agronomists are RealAg on the Weekend, the Soil School, and Profitable Practices. Profitable Practices on Real Agriculture is a video series featuring Canadian producers who are adopting farm practices to have a positive impact on profit, people, and the planet. Profitable Practices is made possible by support from Farm Credit Canada and RBC Royal Bank. All right. I always like it when somebody answers a question with, well, why do we think it has to be that way? So I appreciate Colin flipping that question on its head. It's a really good question on why we think we should only grow one crop. Maybe we should be growing 2, 3, or more. But as we've talked about tonight, there's, of course, challenges to that. Yes, Peter, good grief. You'll see my sheep on that. Profitable practices, you're right. Okay, so let's touch on weed control because it's always a question. Marcel, maybe start with you, and Lana, you've alluded to using Clearfield canola and trying to figure out what your options are. In general, do you find that because you've got 2 species growing that most of these do a decent job with weed suppression, or is it ever good enough to skip a spray entirely, or really is it you just got to pick what you're going to use?
It's nice to have options, and so there's a few of the intercrops where you can use the sulfentrazone authority as a or a couple of them, like, well, the pea canola you could use, put an edge down or something, like something to just give everything a head start, and start, if you can start with something that's not a mess of perennial weeds, and it's got do a burn off right before or right after seeding or something, and give it a real good head start, then a lot of the time it's doing well. I definitely have some, like, I'll have volunteer wheat popping up a lot of the time in my chickpea flax, that we can use a grass herbicide for that. It's usually worthwhile to go hit that. That's one of the problems with your oat. And oat and pea, it works quite nicely, but you've got pretty limited herbicide options. And then what kind of stubble do you put that on? Canola wouldn't be great. Wheat wouldn't be great. And that's a bit of a tricky thing, because you have to be thinking about volunteers also as one of your weeds. So sometimes you end up harvesting 3 grains because you had your volunteer, whatever you grew the previous year, plus your 2 things you actually seeded. I definitely had that going on with peas and oats and flax one year. I planted it on flax stubble. That was interesting.
Interesting sometimes means good, but usually does not. Maryse, what are some of the weed challenges that you're dealing with in the research that you're doing?
It's I think if I have a recommendation for people, is to start with a clean field as well, right? So
Yeah.
then you don't have to worry as much. You can have that pre-plant application or pre-emergence application, and hopefully you get to a point where you get 2 good crops that can compete and can cover that canopy pretty quickly, so that you don't have to have an in-crop weed control. But it's a challenge, and it's going to depend on the intercrops that we're using as well, right? So but yeah, we do need to have a little bit more work to be done with that.
Okay, so now one of the things that I want to touch on is one of the things that Colin mentions in that clip, and that's, the having more than one species, and especially when we're using, an end fixer and a knot, we're using, an oil seed and a pulse, or we've got a lot of diversity there just by adding in a second crop. Maryse, I know that this is some of the work that you've done as well on plant physiology and these sorts of things. Are these successful because, like, do they access nutrients at different depths? Are we looking at how the rooting structure of some of these plants plays a role in their success?
We know that the rooting structures of many of these different groups is different, right? And so we do expect them to be looking at nitrogen in a different way. With pulses, for example, we know that they do tend to exude more acids, and that makes the phosphorus a little bit more available, especially in the more alkaline soils that we have. And so if that happens, then whatever companion crop is being grown with these would also have that benefit as well. It's a little bit, honestly, it's a little bit hard to be looking at, where they're consuming water and where they're consuming the nutrients as well, just because we don't have the very good tools and a very accurate tools to be able to be looking at that. But there's some interesting studies that have looked at, how to separate some of these crops and trying to figure out how they connect to each other, and what kind of chemical signals is basically happening between them. And we think perhaps some of the mycorrhizal association might be, and brassicas don't do it, but if the pulse can benefit from it and somehow share it with the brassicas, then that might be one of the mechanisms that is being used by these the mixtures that we can take advantage of.
Now, go ahead,
I
Lana.
think we don't know what it would be expensive and time consuming to try to dig down and figure out which roots is which in an intercrop setting. I think there's data on rooting depths, average rooting depths for different crops, but those weren't grown in combinations with each other.
Right.
So we know that the above ground growth changes heights and structure and all of these things when we're growing them in combinations. So maybe the same thing is happening with the roots as well. So but I have seen it where there's a couple of crop combinations where it really looks like there's a sort of a death match going on moisture, and everybody's losing.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that before with like flax and dry beans. They were fighting over the same moisture. It seemed like in the same range, and they weren't doing well. But that's just for me looking at how the plants look like they're behaving, and not a big scientific trial on it.
Right. So, but it does bring up a point, certainly, and we talk about, whether it's intercropping or cover cropping, planting green, when, some of these strategies, when moisture is limiting, it are certainly an extra consideration. So, Lana, it's an excellent point, right? Is that if moisture is really limiting, you've got more plants trying to use that water, and if it's at the same depth, is it a detriment versus that crop alone? Is a good question. We're probably not going to answer that in 2 minutes. But I mean, it is interesting for sure that both of you have done some of these trials through extreme drought. Were there other observations in those very dry years as to were there certain intercrops that still did quite well? And I say that knowing that there wasn't a lot that necessarily grew in a lot of areas. Maryse, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, the comparison I'm thinking of is, 2021 versus 2022. And when we're talking about that over yielding and that benefit of having the two crops together, we seem to find a better benefit in the 2021 year where it was really droughty. So it seems that if you do have, some resources that are very limiting, you seem to have more benefits of having these two crops working together.
Okay. Now I will throw out there, I don't know if Jim is watching, but Jim farms near Lancer, Saskatchewan, and he will throw in, if it doesn't rain at all, there's only so much you can do. And
Correct.
So there you are, Jim. It doesn't matter what mix you have out there if it doesn't rain at all. So this year, of course, we're very hopeful that Saskatchewan will see far more rain than the past couple of years. I just want to throw in here, Edgar, we were talking about what harvest season was awful. He suggested it might be 2016 or 2019. 2016 was high moisture growing season, but 2019 was the harvest from hell. So
it was 2019, I think.
Yeah, it might have been. Yeah, 2019 was awful. So there, and Lara de Mozac throws out variable rate intercropping. Maybe the next big thing. I could certainly see where, Lana, as you mentioned, with some of your work in like saline areas or those sorts of things, where maybe varying one or both of the populations of two different crops would be very cool. So very cool. There's a few other questions in here. We won't get to all of them, but one of the other ones, or a few have centered around, we've talked about sometimes if there's a lot of background nitrogen in the soil, of course, pulses may not form rhizobia and actually fix their own N. Maryse, what conditions does that usually happen? Is that with a lot of background N or super wet conditions? When do we usually see that happen?
It can be both, actually. But sometimes it's surprising because we tend to say, if you have more than 40 pounds or 50 pounds of nitrogen in the soil, then the pulse really don't have any incentive to create that symbiosis with rhizobia. But I've seen lentils actually nodulate well, with more than that. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes. If it's very wet, yes, then that's a problem because even if you do have that inoculation that happens and you get the start of those nodule formation, they need to breathe, right? So then they'll just die and rot, and so that's going to be a problem, obviously. Inoculant sometimes, if you don't have good quality inoculant as well, you might not actually have the number of cells that you have. So actually taking care of your inoculant, especially the peat-based one, that's also quite important. Something I tend to remind my students about, because if you leave it on the top of the drum and you go away and you come back 6 hours later and it's been cooking in the sun, it's too late.
It is a living organism, students.
Correct.
Would you like to be left in the sun for 6 hours? Not me. I'd be burnt to a crisp. So just maybe last question on the specific stuff. You did mention, Maryse, a lot of your work with fabas. Was there a winner as far as an intercropping combination with faba beans that really did work?
I think the faba flax and the faba canola would actually
Okay.
be not too bad. Yeah, we there's more I think to do with different
Okay.
brassicas in but the cereals didn't work. So
Okay.
yeah,
That's a no.
I
That's a
wouldn't
hard no.
try barley.
Okay, let's
There's
not.
more to
Okay.
test. There's more
Yeah.
to
Okay.
test actually. Yes,
Yeah.
I think so.
And Lana, work coming up for 2024. Is there anything exciting on the intercropping side this year? Or are you continuing what's been going on? What happens this year at your research farm?
We did a new thing in 2023 and going into 2024 on the chickpea flax. So that's still a combination I'm working on, but we're trying out 3 different varieties of flax and 3 different varieties of chickpeas. So which varieties are more suitable or is a
Okay.
question that I don't think anybody's really scratched the surface on yet. And so that there's a 3-year trial that we're going to be doing that. And then we're doing with and without fungicides on the intercrops and monocrops this year also, and we
Okay.
did it in 2023. We didn't have enough disease in 2023
Right.
at all of the sites, so we were getting yield data but no real disease data. So we're kind of hoping for more disease for 2024 so that we can see, is the intercropping worth 2 applications of fungicides? That would be a really nice number to come up with, because I think it is. It's worth about 2 applications of fungicide.
Mm-hmm. Researchers are funny beasts, you guys, because you want disease to happen so that you can prove something. So yes, but thank you for that, because if it does happen and you get good answers, then we all learn. So it is important. And hey, if we have disease problems, it probably means that it rained, and
Well,
so that's
and
kind of cool.
it's not like Red River is a sensible place to grow chickpeas anyway. Like, we're in the black soil zone. This is not
Right.
a sensible place to grow chickpeas. So that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons that we're a good site for doing this type of work, is we can reliably get diseased chickpeas.
Right. Yeah, which is good for what you're doing. Not so good otherwise. Okay. Yes. Peter says no extra disease. No, disease in Saskatchewan means there's moisture. So that's a totally different story. All right. Let's leave it there. There's so much more we could cover, but this, I think, we got some really great visuals, some great questions. I really appreciate everybody for sending them in. Lana and Maryse, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun and incredibly informative. And if anybody's got any feedback, just zip us an email, and we can connect you or get some answers if we didn't get to your question tonight. But Lana and Maryse, thank you so much.
Yep. You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a good
Okay.
evening.
We'll wrap up tonight. Next week, I've got Tracy Bowdy and John Gavlosky joining me to talk about early insect pressure. So if you've got any insects that are bugging you or on your mind, see what I did there? Let us know. Join us next week, 8 p.m. Eastern, of course. And we'll see you then. Cheers, everybody.